So if that's what you're looking for, you are in the right place. So my name is Rebekah Haskell. I'm a cover designer and an illustrator, and I have been designing and illustrating books in the independent publishing space since 2013, so about 10 years now. And I'm the owner and lead designer of vividcovers.com. Gosh, this thing's so slow. There we go. There we go. At Vivid Covers, we primarily focus on anything that lives underneath the umbrella of speculative fiction, so sci-fi, fantasy, and their associated subgenres. So in the 10 years that I've been designing covers, I've worked with hundreds of authors on over 1,000 covers, and these days you'll see them pop up pretty often in the top 1,000 on Amazon, which is really exciting every time that happens. I've had the privilege of working with some really phenomenal authors on a lot of projects, including Craig Martelle, Daniel Aronson, Rick Partlow, Rachel Aukus, and my husband, Jeffrey H. Haskell. His sci-fi novel, Against All Odds, was up for a Dragon Award this year, which was with my cover, his book, which was a first for the both of us. We didn't win. We didn't win, but we were up against David Weber and Timothy Zahn, so I was like, the chances were pretty slim there. But just having our work up there with such phenomenal authors in that genre, it was really thrilling. So I got into cover art actually because I am also a writer. I have a perpetually almost finished fantasy series that will eventually one day see the light of day. But in the meantime, covers have really become kind of my dream job. It's been an absolute blast. And I feel like my perspective as both a writer and an artist has given me just kind of a unique take on that gap that can sometimes kind of exist between word people and picture people. And that's what I'm hoping to help you guys with a little bit today. Maybe whether or not you've never commissioned a cover before or you've got 10 in the bag, that maybe I can give you some tools that are going to help you bridge that gap and make the most of your knowledge and your designer's expertise and really maximize what is probably the most critical single aspect of your book's marketing strategy. So at the end, if we have any remaining time afterwards, I will go ahead and take any questions. So if you have any questions on the process, how to find a designer, how to vet them, how to communicate with them, anything that I haven't covered, then just hang on to those and we'll try to grab those at the end. So first things first, what is the purpose of a book cover? Hint, it is not a visual extension of your story. Now, that does seem a little bit counterintuitive, so I will explain. When we as writers are thinking of, especially first-time authors, this is sometimes something we like to think about, just sort of way you like to do the imaginary casting of your book and Hollywood characters for the eventual live-action adaptation of your book. We like to think about what's going to be on the covers. But in general, we think, well, what is my story? What we should be asking ourselves is, who is my audience? An effective cover is less a representation of your story than it is a representation of your intended audience. And the reason is because covers are a method of communication more than they are creative expression, and they speak in the language of genre. But genres, as anybody I think who has written in a genre and kind of chafed under what feels like the restrictions of that genre can attest, genres are artificial constructs. Whereas books are living, breathing, enormously complex things. They have themes and threads of nuance. They are entire worlds, far more than can or should be communicated on a book cover. So an example I like to use is this. Imagine that you're moving and you're trying to pack up your kitchen and accurately label all of the boxes. So sometimes that's gonna be like super easy. You've got a box and it's dishes, no problem, done. And sometimes I have to settle for kitchen stuff, even though the kitchen stuff box is without a doubt going to include Post-it notes and batteries and maybe a couple screwdrivers and some rubber bands and a couple of recipe booklets that I have had for like 15 years, still never cooked anything out of it, but I keep them because I feel like I should, and maybe some appliance manuals. So kitchen stuff isn't really accurate. It is certainly not specific, but it gets the box into the right room in my new house. So genres are the same, and covers that speak the language of genre are also the same. A book is not science fiction. A book it's a unique creation. We call it science fiction because it shares enough attributes with other books also called science fiction. And the label isn't there to constrain you as an author. The label is there to help readers who enjoy those attributes to find those books. Now, obviously, every science fiction reader isn't going to enjoy every science fiction book, but it narrows the field down. It gets the box of stuff into the right room. So that's the what of covers. Let's talk a little bit about how it does this. The most basic place to start with this is, what is good design? Obviously, this is a huge question, and I could answer it in a number of different ways, and if this was a room full of designers, I'd answer it differently. But the answer that I think is going to be most helpful to you as authors in conceptualizing some of these things we're going to talk about is, good design is the visual presentation of ideas that help the human eye perform its function in a way that is most natural. So let's talk a little bit about how humans perceive visual data. Come on. This is the best slide in the whole presentation. Okay, there we go. Some animals in the animal kingdom are geared toward identifying color or movement. That's how they perceive their spatial environment. And we as humans, we are geared toward identifying shapes. We do that primarily through the use of contrast, which is the delineation in any set of visual data between light and dark. The light and dark parts of the image are what help us view that shape. So this is actually the reason why, despite memes to the contrary, camouflage actually works really well on us, and you should probably wear an orange vest while you're hunting. And so the use of clear, easily distinguishable shapes in design is essential to help our eyes perform its most natural function. So when presented with an image that doesn't allow us to do that easily, we actually experience a vague sense of discomfort that can be almost physical. And our initial impulse in that situation is to look away, which is pretty much the opposite of what we want our covers to be doing. The next thing is, priority matters. Once we've distinguished the shapes, we want to be able to evaluate how important and how relevant those shapes are to us. So imagine your ancestors, many, many times ancestors are in the jungle, and they see tree, leaf, vine, jaguar, leaf, tree. It is in their best interest to very quickly identify which of those shapes are the most significant and relevant to them in that moment. So if the eye can't determine what shapes in an image in a set of visual data are the most important ones, we again experience that vague sense of discomfort. Now, artists can use a lot of different techniques in order to help the eye prioritize. We use light. The human eye is attracted to light. Another thing that we can do that is a little bit one of the more it's Art 301. Okay, is we can use the lines of the surrounding elements around the focal point to lead the eye where we want it to go. We can actually control the order in which someone who's viewing the image looks at each individual point on the image. And we use that with the lines of the surrounding elements. So we're talking about the angle of the barrel of a gun or of a sword. We're talking about the cant of an airplane or a spaceship's wings, or even the direction that a character's hair is blowing in the wind, or the drape of their clothing. We can use those lines to direct the viewer's eye to the focal point, or to the title, or to the side where the buy button is, where the blurb in the buy button is. We can use those lines to do that. But this need to prioritize those shapes is the reason why you get one or two major focal points in an image maximum, okay? One is better. And it's also why it's really important not to clutter a cover with a lot of small, unnecessary details, even if those details have relevance in the context of your story. Because if everything is a focal point, nothing is. Remember that you can't emphasize everything in an image. Trying to make every single element that's on your cover pop is going to have roughly the same effect as writing your entire manuscript in italics. It is very, very quickly going to stop being effective as a means of emphasis because it's all going to be the same. So a couple more quick details on how we perceive visual input. First, humans like looking at humans, and we like symmetry or asymmetry, but you have to commit. So the first one, the fact that we love looking at other humans, this has been studied thoroughly by marketing companies. It's the reason most ads or commercials will include humans in it, humans. It'll include people rather than just having shots of the inanimate product that they're selling. This doesn't mean that you have to have a human on your cover. It's just kind of it's a shortcut to grabbing the viewer's attention. And there are some genres in which it's less common to have a human element on the cover. For instance, I'm thinking of psychological thrillers, military sci-fi. Military sci-fi, it's not unusual, but there are a lot of bestsellers that don't have a human element. But in absence of that human element, you're going to need to use other techniques in order to grab that attention. In psychological thrillers, off the top of my head, a lot of times they'll have very short, punchy, and attention-grabbing titles that are very big and bold on the cover. So it'll be like landscape or something like that, and then really big, catchy titles in big, bold lettering. For military sci-fi, there's a lot of that really nice spaceship engine glow in the darkness of space, or there's going to be lasers or explosions, that sort of thing. So you need something else that's going to catch attention. A word of caution. Because we like looking at humans so much, we've been doing it since the moment of birth, and we are very, very good at it. Especially human faces, we're really, really good at telling when something's a little off, even if we can't really articulate what it is. This is why you have to be really careful to avoid what's called the uncanny valley when using 3D or AI-generated art. Something that looks almost human, but not quite, it can actually trigger a slight disgust or anxiety response, okay? It's the reason why we kind of side-eye clowns and dolls, okay? And why waxy museums are usually cool and creepy in equal measures, and why everybody got so freaked out about the Polar Express movie that came out a while back. That's not how you want people to feel when they're looking at your cover. It's better to go for art that's clearly illustrated than something that almost looks real. So back to symmetry. We like symmetry or asymmetry, but you have to commit. This is not the place to be indecisive. A cover where the elements are centered or they're balanced to one side or the other. These are going to be more visually pleasing than something that's just slightly off center. This is like nails on a chalkboard for my eyes. That's not what we're going for with our covers. And so good design is going to, I have to move this because I can't look at it anymore. Good design is going to communicate effectively while facilitating the eye's natural function and without triggering any confusion or disgust or discomfort while it's doing that. Now here's where I think it gets really interesting, okay? We're going to take a little quick hop from biology over to psychology. Humans are wired to perceive our environment as shapes or silhouettes. Now, if you take those shapes and you take higher cognition in the form of abstract thought and you put those two things together, you get symbolism. Humans respond really, really well to symbols. It's how we think in the absence of linguistic thought. And through symbols, we can comprehend very complex and sophisticated concepts in a fraction of a second, much less time than it would take you to name the concept, much less describe it, okay? That's the reason why we say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And it's actually the reason we have images on our book covers at all. It's because the way our brains respond to symbolism. So your book needs to have strong visual cues in order to attract readers who are going to enjoy the type of book that you've written, and at the same time signal to those outside that group that this isn't the book for them. That second part is actually pretty important as well, because if you don't do that second part right, you may get more sales, but you'll pay for that in bad reviews on the back end, as people aren't getting what they expected to get. So this is the entire purpose of your book's cover, the whole thing. And it has a very limited amount of time to do this, about 3 to 6 seconds. Covers have about 3 to 6 seconds maximum to say what they need to say and entice the viewer to read the blurb. That's the order of operations. Cover, blurb, first page. That's how it goes. So think about that, 6 seconds maximum. The cover is not the place to symbolize your character's inner journey. It's not the place to attempt to communicate the nuances of what makes your book special. That's the job of your blurb and your first page. The cover just needs to get the box into the right room. And in order to do that, it needs to speak the language of genre. So I had a client that I worked with a few years ago who was working with me on a very gritty, kind of dark, definitely grown-up sci-fi novel. And he was really adamant that we needed to have a rainbow on the cover. The theme of the rainbow, it was something that recurred as a theme in his book, and the symbol recurred often within the context of the story, and it kind of symbolized his character's emotional arc from the beginning to the end of the story. Unfortunately, a rainbow on the cover of a really gritty, dark, grown-up sci-fi novel sends some really mixed messages about the intended audience and the tone of the book. And so anybody who is actually actively looking for a gritty, dark, grown-up sci-fi novel was going to see that cover, see the rainbow, and think, well, that's not for me, and move on. The symbols that you place on your cover, they matter, because the elements that you use have built-in meaning to your audience. Symbols don't just represent concepts and ideas. They can be emotionally powerful in a way that transcends language, depending on what we emotionally associate with each symbol. So back in 2019, that was my first 20 Books, was in 2019, and I sat in on a presentation delivered by Chris Fox, who was actually discussing this concept of symbols. And I remember being in the audience and turning to my husband and being so excited and saying, oh my gosh, somebody gets it. So if I show you a picture of a sunset or a birthday cake, you're gonna have a very different response than if I show you the picture of a zombie or a spider. I'm not gonna show those slides for anybody who's arachnophobic. Don't worry, I gotcha, okay? But this kind of communication can be incredibly powerful, and it can, if you can identify the right symbols to communicate with your specific intended audience. In a certain sense, you can actually use these symbols to capitalize on the hard work of other authors in order to sell your book. It's almost like, I like to think of it as kind of like a little cheat code in order to get a little bit of investment out of your potential readers before they've even read a single line of your book. I'll explain that, okay? When readers look for a new book to read, by and large, this is the vast majority of readers, okay? When they already know what kind of book that they're in the mood for. They already know what they're looking for. Usually, they're hoping to find a book that's going to give them an emotional experience that's similar to other books that they have read and loved. A good cover, an effective cover, is going to use symbols that the reader is already familiar with to create a tiny little microcosm of that experience. For example, I love epic fantasy. That is my genre. I love it. I love the themes. I love the huge, big, world-moving plots and the sense of wonder and adventure and the exercise of personal agency and the discovery of latent power. Such good stuff. And I've read a lot of it, okay? So over time, I've come to associate that emotional experience with symbols that I've encountered over and over again through those stories. So here are just a few in no particular order. Dragons, castles. No, they're in no particular order. I was worried I'd numbered them. Dragons, castles, swords or daggers, sweeping vistas, magic, and for whatever reason, cloaks. These are actually some of the most powerful symbols that you can use when you're communicating with fans of epic fantasy. Because when we see a dragon, we don't just see a mythical flying lizard. We feel all those feels from every book with a dragon in it that we've ever read and loved. It's evocative for us. It evokes Bilbo hiding from Smaug. It evokes Sturm Brightblade's Last Stand. That last one still, after all these years, gets me a little choked up. Those powerful feelings, those are down to the hard work of those authors. But if you're clever and you're strategic about the symbols that you and your designer choose to put on your cover, you can take advantage of that hard work for the benefit of your book. Now, obviously, the symbols that you use are going to be different depending on what genre that you're writing in, the content of your book. And in most cases, you're not going to want to put a dragon on a cover where there's no dragons. For the most part, if you've written an epic fantasy, for instance, where it's set in a world where dragons exist, but the dragons don't factor heavily into the story, and you want to put a dragon flying in the sky in the background, that's legitimate to reinforce that fantasy-ness to it. Likewise, sometimes you can use a spaceship for a sci-fi novel. Let's say in the setting, interplanetary travel is a thing, but the whole story takes place planet side. Using a spaceship is still, that's totally a legit way to use it, and it can be useful if, for whatever reason, you're not able to use some of the more common genre symbols on that cover. So you can reinforce that feeling of genre, but you don't want it necessarily to be the primary focal point unless it factors heavily into the book, because at that point it starts to imply a large degree of relevance to the actual story, but it can be useful. For the most part, though, what you're looking for is you're looking for that place where the concepts present in your story and the symbols your readers respond to overlap. That little spot there in the middle, that is money. That's what we're shooting for when we're creating a cover. So then the next obvious question is, how do you know what symbols are going to be most powerful for your reader? Well, first, you have to know who the reader is. Sometimes I will have new authors come to me and they'll say, hey, listen, I don't know anything about design, I don't know anything about art. Do I need to know, basically, do I need to take a course in order to have a good cover? The short answer is no. If you're working with an experienced, reputable designer, our job is to fill those gaps in for you. If you have those gaps in your understanding of art and design, that's my job. What I do need, and every designer needs from every author, is we need you to know what you've written. Okay, and that can actually, it can be pretty tough. Or more specifically, we need to know who you've written it for. And I know that can be difficult. The way to find that basically is it's research. Research is a huge part of not just writing, but also learning to market your book and figuring out what kind of book you've written. Where does it go in the marketplace? That's when you're going to need to rely on your beta readers. If you're working with an editor, they can help you drill down maybe on some of the subgenres that your book may fall into. Get familiar with the Amazon categories in which you may be selling your book. See what else is being sold there. Read the blurbs, maybe read some of the books. Get familiar with the marketplace so that you know where your book is going to fit in. Once you know who you've written the story for, then you need to find out the language that other books with similar attributes are using to communicate with those readers. And the Amazon bestseller lists are pretty fantastic for this. It's like pre-selected prioritization for us. So right here what I have is, this is the bestseller list for the military sci-fi category as of a couple days ago. So what I did is I went to Amazon, I went to the bestseller lists, then I went to the Kindle store, Kindle ebooks, then I drilled down to science fiction and fantasy, then science fiction, and then military. From this point, you could go to Space Fleet or Space Marine, but I just stayed in the general military sci-fi. So what you're going to have to do with these bestseller lists, though, you need to do a little bit of work. You're going to need to weed out anything that's miscategorized. And in most genres, there's a fair bit of that. And you're also going to need to remove anything that's traditionally published. Traditionally published books have access, they're sold via a marketing infrastructure that indies don't have access to. And it is actually a pretty different approach to selling books. So, and it's there's a lot less emphasis on the cover. So with traditional books, they're going to have a lot more freedom to be experimental and to be more subtle than you're going to have as an indie. So you want to look for independent books in your genre. I think in this list here, the only one we need to take out is Fuel's Paradise there on the bottom row. That's by Robert Asprin. That's traditionally published. But once you've got your list, then you're going to want to look for the independent books that are selling well in your genre, and then evaluate the covers and see what symbols are popping up over and over and again on those covers. Like for here, we got a spaceship in space. We've got another spaceship in space. We've got a spaceship in atmosphere. There's a guy standing in front of a spaceship in space. There's some space marines in a big battle. Another spaceship in space. A person in front of a spaceship in dock. And you're starting to see some recurring elements. So do that in your genre. Make a list of those symbols that you're seeing popping up over and over again, and then have that on hand when you talk to your designer. So, now we've talked a little bit about the things you should be put on your cover. Let's talk a little bit about the things that you should probably avoid. The first thing I want to talk about is a lot of detail that is only meaningful to someone familiar with the story. This point is also known as your cover is not for you. The process of having your ideas turned into art is actually really thrilling. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun seeing something that you've only seen in your head rendered out into color by somebody else's creativity. However, remember that the cover isn't for you. The cover is for someone who has absolutely zero prior knowledge of your story. At this point, most of them won't even have read the blurb, okay? So they know nothing. They know the title, they know the cover, okay? That's the information that they have. So by the logic we've laid out, I'm going to say something that's going to be a little controversial. Please don't hate me. It doesn't matter if your artist gets your character's hair color right. It doesn't matter. Now, should your artist get your character's hair color right? Sure, absolutely. In the 10 years I've been doing covers, there's never been a single instance where there was some reason we couldn't do it that way. But for instance, let's say you don't have the budget for custom art and you need to get a pre-made. Okay, a pre-made, for anybody who doesn't know, is a cover. Like, for instance, I got some time in my schedule. I have the idea for a cover. Nobody asked me for this cover. I just think it'll look cool. So I make the cover, I stick it up on my website, and I charge a lot less for it than I would a custom cover because it's generally faster. I'm doing it because I want to, but it's made on spec. So somebody comes along and says, that'd be perfect for my book. And there's little to no customization on pre-mades in general with most designers, but they cost significantly less. It's a really phenomenal way to get good art on your cover if you don't have a custom budget. But let's say you found a pre-made cover that it fits your book, it's got all the right symbols, it's saying all the right things to the right people, but oh my gosh, she's blonde, and in the book she's a redhead. Don't panic, don't panic. By the time your reader knows enough about your story to discern a discrepancy, they've bought the book. The cover did its job, and if the book is good, they won't care. I promise you this, they won't care. That's not, obviously, again, that's not to say that you shouldn't have the aspects of, you shouldn't have details of your book be accurate on your cover if you're working with a designer to achieve that. Just be aware that when you tell your designer that it's really, really important that the character have this specific necklace on in the cover, or that they have this specific weapon, or that they're left-handed and they're not right-handed, understand that the designer is making those changes for you, not for your reader. It doesn't impact your reader at all. Those changes are for you, and that's okay. It is absolutely 100% okay to have details on your covers that gratify you as the author. Just understand the order of importance and don't sacrifice the power of your cover for absolute fidelity. You're not selling art. You're selling your novel. You're selling a story. So when push comes to shove, serve the prospective reader. Speak to them in a language they understand with symbols that are already meaningful to them. So the next point is more like part 2 on this theme, which is things to avoid. Too much story. Too much story. Remember the 6-second rule. You can use all the right symbols and still miss the mark if you try to include too many. Okay? I run into this issue fairly often when I'm working with newer authors who are really struggling to generalize their story. It's the same thing that makes it so difficult to write blurbs, okay? When you're really, really close to something and it means a lot to you, it's really, really hard to prioritize all of the aspects of it and decide what's critical and what you can omit, okay? Or if you're on the edges of your genre. If you have a really unique take on a common theme in your genre, the place to tell your reader about that is your blurb, not your cover. The cover is for the broad strokes. It's for the commonalities, the shared attributes that are promising to give the reader the kind of emotional experience that they're already specifically looking for because of its similarity to other books that they've read and loved in the genre. Focus on what your book is, not what your book isn't, and remember how little time you have to work with. 6 seconds maximum, probably closer to 3. If a prospective reader has to decipher all of the hints that you've included in order to grasp what you're saying, you've lost them. If they have to zoom way in order to understand what kind of story you're telling, you've lost them. It doesn't matter how good and richly detailed the art is if they never take the time to appreciate it. The next one is a scene from the book. Okay, when I say this to authors, it tends to be as controversial as the hair color thing. Because that's generally the place we go to for ideas, and that's logical. So to be fair, this is more of a proceed with caution situation than a strict prohibition, okay? The specific settings and events of your book can serve as excellent inspiration when you and your cover designer are brainstorming a cover concept. However, there are some drawbacks involved in trying to directly transpose a scene from the book onto the cover. The first problem is that, as we've discussed, you need to be very deliberate and specific with the symbols that you're using what symbols you omit, and in order to make sure your cover is saying exactly the right thing to exactly the right people. The likelihood that you have, without intending to, just happen to have written a scene that incorporates all of those symbols while still accounting for some pretty specific design limitations that are involved in making a cover. For instance, we need it to be high contrast. We need clear composition. We need a genre-appropriate color palette. We need a maximum of 2 primary focal points. 1 is better. It needs to fit the 2:3 aspect ratio of a book cover, and it needs to allow quite a bit of room for title text and your author name and your series subtitle if you want one. So the chances that you have a scene that will perfectly fit that bill are pretty slim. That in and of itself is not a problem if you're willing to be flexible. However, I found that a lot of times when we're drawing directly from a scene from the book, it's really difficult to not get caught up to get hung up on accuracy, or that's not how it happened in the book, okay? If you can be flexible with the specifics of the scene and keep in mind the primary goal of communication, it's absolutely possible to feature a scene from the book on your cover. Just make sure that your primary goal is an effective cover, and don't let the specifics of your scene get in the way of good design. Finally, last point is bad typography. This is something that can ruin even the most beautifully illustrated covers with the most carefully selected symbols. Just imagine you have gone to the trouble and considerable expense of commissioning some beautiful artwork for your cover. And then you just stick that baby in Word and you slap some text on. That's what we're going to do here. Yeah, that's the stuff. Oh, it's gorgeous. This is like toilet papering a Ferrari, okay? You would be better off saving the cash that you spent on the artwork and just like drawing some stick figures in paint and putting that on your cover, okay? Let's fix that, because that's hurting my heart a little bit. There we go. To make things even more complicated when it comes to typography, not every artist is a good typographer. It's a completely different skill set, and we possess that skill at varying levels, okay? This is also one of the hard parts about, for instance, hiring an artist who's not specifically a cover designer. Not only will they possibly not understand the language of symbols that you're trying to use to communicate with your ideal reader within your genre, sometimes they won't have any typography skills at all. So you're going to need to find somebody else who's really good at typography to keep all of that beautiful artwork from going to waste. Okay, let's leave on a positive note before I break and see if you guys have any questions for me, okay? We're just going to recap some of what we've talked about. Covers communicate through symbols, and they do that through the language of genre. Each genre is going to have their own specific dialect of the symbols that they use, and you want to find a designer who's fluent in that dialect. Each subgenre is going to have its own accent. You know what? I think we've exhausted the possibilities of that analogy, but you know what I'm saying. Your cover has 3 to 6 seconds maximum to do the work that it needs to do. And that's not a lot of time. So you need to be really careful about what symbols you're choosing. Human eyes are drawn to shapes through contrast. So that's the difference between light and dark. And we also, because of that, we need 1 or 2 focal points maximum. Humans like looking at humans. Doesn't mean that you need to have a human on your cover, but it is a way to grab attention. But be careful with the 3D, okay? Be careful with 3D and AI. We don't want to creep anybody out. So humans like symmetry or asymmetry, but don't be wishy-washy about it. Choose your symbols wisely, and don't sacrifice the power of your symbols and ultimately the effectiveness of your cover to communicate with your chosen audience for absolute fidelity to your story. Ultimately, keep in mind that a good designer, we have the same goal you do. We want the cover we make for you to sell the hell out of your book. I mean, it is almost as good for us if you had a bestseller with our cover on it as it is for you, okay? We want that for you. If you can both approach the book from the same place with that motivation behind your creative decisions and with an acknowledgement that it's the communication aspect of the cover that's the most critical aspect. Not only are you going to end up with a better cover, with a more effective cover that's going to do better justice to your book, that also is going to eliminate 90% of the friction that can sometimes spring up between authors and their designers as they work together. Creating a cover is absolutely a collaborative effort between the author and the designer, and that does require some unity in purpose. So do your research carefully on a designer. Choose someone that you can really trust, not just from an artistic standpoint, but from a marketing standpoint. On that note, make sure you're looking at portfolios, okay? You don't want to hire, when I was newer in the business, I had a lot of people say, well, can you do this? Well, can you do that? You shouldn't ever have to ask that question. There should be evidence in the designer's portfolio that they can do the thing that you need them to do. You need to be able to see it with your own eyes, not just have them say, oh yeah, I can do that. You want to be able to see that they can do what you need them to do. So do your research carefully and make sure your designer is willing to approach it not just from an artistic standpoint, but also from a marketing standpoint. And then you can work together with them to give your book its absolute best chance out there in the marketplace. I'd like to go ahead. We've got about 10 minutes, I think. So do you have any questions for me?
Hi. Whoops. I don't know if you're familiar with the golden ratio, but does that figure in covers?
The golden ratio is just a more complicated way to explain our desire, the way we enjoy asymmetry. We do enjoy asymmetry within the boundaries of the golden ratio. I usually don't talk about the golden ratio because it's a pretty artisty thing, you know what I'm saying? But yeah, if you guys want to Google the golden ratio, you can get a little bit more perspective on exactly how we perceive asymmetry and find that beautiful.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I have two questions, which are kind of the same.
Mm-hmm.
When you're working with a writer to design the cover, how does that conversation usually go, and what information do you need from them to design it?
Absolutely. So I think besides knowing exactly, one of the things that I get a lot of questions about are exactly how does that process go, how do we share ideas. I have a brief with questions for you to fill out, questions about the synopsis of your story, questions about your characters, about your settings and that sort of thing. The conversation usually goes, what are you writing? Who's it for? What genre are we shooting for? Tell me a little bit about the tone of the book. Sometimes tone and themes, that can be really helpful when constructing the artwork. But also, in general, excerpts aren't as useful as authors think that they are. Because when you're writing prose, you're trying not to be clinical and prescriptive, but I need you to be clinical and prescriptive. I need to know the height, weight, build, hair color, eye color, skin color, you know what I'm saying? So I just need the facts. I need the facts. And that's actually more helpful to me. And I've had authors say, well, why don't you read the book first? Well, first of all, there's the hourly ROI, okay? The price of the book, of the cover is going to skyrocket if I've got to spend time reading your book. Yeah. But also because just getting those details helps me generalize the book in a way that's more difficult if you know everything about it, and it helps pick out those things that are most important. So a lot of designers will have a form that you fill out with the specific questions they're asking for. Just remember the clothes, okay? Every author, every single one of you, forget to tell me what kind of clothes they're wearing. There have been times when I've been tempted to send a draft back with just naked characters and be like, does this look good? Anyway, does that answer your question?
Yeah,
is that helpful?
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, when it comes to typography, is there any rule of thumb for where the author's name goes versus the title of the book? Because I've seen it a lot of different ways, and I don't know.
Honestly, the placement of the typography is really dependent on the image. You're looking for the right place in the image that's not going to obscure any critical detail, but that's also not going to necessarily, especially for indies, your name is not the draw, okay? The image is going to be the draw, then maybe the title, then maybe your author name. If you're Stephen King or Tom Clancy, obviously you just put their name on there. You don't even need images, and it'll sell the book, you know? But the author name and the title of placement is going to depend on the image and where we want to lead the eye, basically.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, do you have any recommendations for studying typography or where someone could go to learn more about it?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Basically, you need to find somebody who's really good at typography. My favorite is, there's a site called Bookfly Design. It's a design group. They do nice covers, really good covers, but their typography is just, I drool over the typography, okay? It's gorgeous typography. So you want to find examples of it that are good, okay? And then you want to try to imitate that See if you can experiment with similar fonts, with different wordings, and it's mostly an exercise of practice. One of the things that beginning typographers struggle with a lot is kerning, which is the space between each individual character, and that needs to be roughly equalized. A good trick is to kind of look at the typography you've done and sort of unfocus your eyes, and you'll get as it blurs, you'll get a sense of the balance of the words, and you'll be more able to easily see if there's too much space between a character and another. Anyway,
Thank
I hope
you.
that helps.
Hi, I write in contemporary romance, and it's a really big trend right now to do the illustrated covers. So much so that Sweet and Steamy and even women's fiction, they're all doing that. I've seen even like billionaire six-pack, books now doing, doing
right.
covers in illustrated. So number one question is, how long do trends like that last, and will your book be outdated in a couple of years if you use illustrated as an example? But then number two is, how do I make mine stand out with my symbols when so many genres are using this illustrated, meet cute kind of image?
That's the basic point here. You're not trying to stand out. You're trying to be the thing that they're looking for, the specific thing. And the fact that there are other things that they're looking for, you want to be a really, really good example of what they're expecting to see on. So obviously, just any art's not going to do. You want it to be a really, really well done version of what they're seeing over and over again. Obviously, in a genre that is as saturated as contemporary romance, there's other techniques that you're going to have to use along with just putting your book out there in order to get eyeballs on it. But in general, the cover's not where you're trying to be unique. If you already have a big name and a big readership, you can create trends within a genre. But in romance is a huge genre. You've got to be pretty big in order to drive trends like that. So in general, what you're looking for with your cover is not going to be to create any trends or to make yourself unique. It's to make yourself a good example of the thing that they're looking for. As far as the length of the trends, it really depends. Trends don't change super fast, but they do change over time. Here's the good thing about a cover, okay? I don't know if it's the good thing. It is the good thing, because sometimes you don't get it right on your first try, okay? You can change your cover anytime you want to and have the funds to do so. So if you release a book and that cover just is not moving copies for you, you can try another crack at it. And if the genre does move past this particular trend of illustrated covers, that's something that you can address then. Most books, like even traditionally published books, don't have the same cover for all of eternity. It is something that does eventually change. Hopefully, it'll change when the book has done a little bit for you and can therefore pay for itself. That's what
Is there a resource to go to find out, like I definitely see with your sci-fi, like what the symbols are, but what symbols would be in of romance? Like that
you would
want
just
on
go
those-
to those best-selling lists on
bestsellers?
Amazon for your
Okay,
genre.
perfect,
Yeah,
thank you.
Basically.
I'm writing historical fiction and women's fiction. In Canada, I see the trend is like women looking away, just their back or just their hands, just their feet. Can you speak, why is that like, one of the genres you see the woman's face. Can you see like, why is it like that in historical fiction? What is it going for?
Because historical fiction, for a lot of the point of historical fiction is to transport you into a specific setting at a specific time. And that's the point of the story. It's not so much, it is about the character, but it is more about that setting at that time period. And so you use symbols in slightly different ways depending on what the focus of the book is. Like for instance, epic fantasy is going to have a lot more sweeping vistas than sword and sorcery. Sword and sorcery are smaller, more personal stories, where epic fantasy are the big world-moving plots. So epic fantasy tends to have more sweeping vistas and big long shots, whereas sword and sorcery tends to have really up-close images. I do feel like that's a lot of the reason behind the historical fiction. For women's fiction, I feel like a lot of that is because the books are in some way, they are a little bit self-insertion for women. And to have too much specificity for the characters' facial features is a little distancing for the reader. So, hope that's helpful.
Just a follow-up question on the typography. Is that always separate from the cover design, or are there cover design companies that do the typography as well?
I do all of my, well, and that's not necessarily true. It depends. Most cover designers will do their own typography if they are specifically a cover designer. If you go to ArtStation and you find an artist, I don't know, maybe you have the cash to hire someone who does promo art for League of Legends and you want that to be on your cover, okay? And you got that kind of cash, go for it, okay? They're probably not going to do the typography for you because that's not what they do. You're going to need to find somebody else to do the typography. For most artists who are cover designers, they will do the typography. If you are working with a cover designer and you feel like their typography is a little shaky, in most cases, it's totally legitimate to tell them, hey, listen, I want to hire you to do some art. I've already got somebody on the line to do my branding, so if that's okay, most designers will be okay with that. If you're working with a publisher, for instance, I do a lot of covers for 20Books, and Steve does their typography. He does a phenomenal job as well. So I just send them the artwork, and they put the typography on there. So most cover designers who are specifically cover designers will do their own typography, but you have some flexibility there if you would like to.
Cool, great.
All right, guys, I think that's our time. Thank you so much for being here. I hope that this is helpful for you and it benefits your books going forward. And I think that's it for the conference, isn't it? This was our last session. Do we have one? We have one more panel. Looking forward to it. All right. Thank you so much.